So I was thinking about our conversation last time, and I was so appreciative after that conversation because you totally allowed me to come to the conversation and just verbalize how I was feeling, which was in that moment, I was really tired and overwhelmed. And one of the things that I know I had said to you during that conversation was, I have I have a big job. We both have these huge jobs. And I have all of these, even without COVID, all of these different things going on, like every day feeling like all these things are sort of tugging at me. And I have a daughter going off to college during COVID. And, just thinking about where I really need to be spending my time. And one of the things I have felt through COVID is that I've spent a lot of time working and trying to sort of hold everything together, both in my job, my corporate job, and at home, and in my passion project, which is my coaching, and really thinking about how I can give back to the world in that way. And so I was feeling the last time we talked about how I just was feeling this call to really focus on my home, like my children, my home, getting my daughter off, myself. I was feeling, not very well rested. Um, and you just allowed me to verbalize that and say that. And you sort of gave me an out, like, okay, well, we can, postpone our conversations. We can postpone the project that we're working on, which is not what I want to do, because I get so excited, about working on anything having to do with coaching and compassion and all of those things. But if I fast forward, so that was 2 weeks ago. If I fast forward to today, it's interesting because I've had to accept that I'm in a season of overwhelm. It just is where I am. It has not gotten better since we talked last time. In fact, it's even more apparent that I am exactly where I'm supposed to be in terms of focusing on my home, my son starting online school, my daughter leaving for college, and all of the craziness and logistical and anxieties that go along with that right now during this time. And also continuing to do good work at my job, not allowing everything. And so I was thinking about this morning about how overwhelmed is actually how I feel right now. And I want to simplify. And yet I literally feel like in this moment, I can't simplify. It is literally a state of overwhelm.
So thank you for sharing that, Sam. I have thought so much since our conversation too about just being overwhelmed, being exhausted. You and I work with a lot of different people and talk about change, and you think about saturation of change and how people consume that. And if you look back to like the beginning of COVID, you and I were both people saying, we're fine, like we've got this and this isn't so bad, and I can switch to being at home and I can manage all these things. But so I went and I did some research because I was like, this is really interesting, because I've had this conversation with a couple other friends who were also completely fine. And now they've just kind of hit this wall, and it's like, I'm having a hard time being motivated to work and all these things that are normal for me. And it's like, this doesn't seem right that I don't have motivation to even cook dinner. And what is wrong. And what I learned is that we have actually been in fight or flight mode since the beginning. And because like to your point, like we have big corporate jobs, and these were all women that also have big corporate jobs and have families and have hobbies and passion projects. We're so used to that adrenaline of when you just have to power through something, that we have been powering through months and months and months of this, and our bodies aren't designed to be able to do that. And so at some point, we have to stop and listen to our bodies are finally starting to crash. And that's why we're all feeling like exhausted and overwhelmed. And it's not something that's familiar to us. And trying to, like, you were so in touch with it when we talked a couple of weeks ago, where you're just like, I have to do less and I have to focus on what's more important. And I think we're going to see a whole wave of people starting to need to do that. I know personally, like going into COVID, and like, so we went through March and that was uncertain. And it's like, okay, so we'll get through April and May and we'll get to summer and our weather will be nicer and we'll be able to be outside. And there was kind of this idea that, you know, businesses may reopen at the end of July. We might have like this little respite of normalcy. And we never got that.
Yeah.
So we've just, like, every month it's like, well, will it get better? And I remember thinking back in May and canceling trips and stuff. And it's like, okay, well, maybe I'll still be able to do that trip in July and go see my father-in-law. And as long as we get everything like taken care of before the fall, in case we have another wave. But we never had that break.
Mm-hmm.
So how long can we operate in this state of fear and anxiety and constant change without showing any compassion to ourselves?
I think that is so true when you said, like, we've been in fight or flight mode from the beginning. That is, you know, I hadn't thought about that before, but that is true. And I can say for me personally, and probably for you too, like, I can pretty much power through anything. And my mantra is like, I'm fine, you know, I'm fine. And it's really interesting because I have been feeling really exhausted. And in my role as a VP of people, I really feel for my all of my colleagues and all of my teammates that are also in the same state and trying to be productive and hold things together. And some of them have young children at home, and everybody is sort of just trying to get through. And you're right, thinking about, I mean, we never expected it to last this long. And so it's interesting because I noticed a few weeks ago that the employees that I work with, no one's taking vacation. So no one's taking vacation days, and and me included, and it feels like, because there's not really anywhere great to go. And so what's the point? Vacation plans have been squashed. Those sort of trips where you may have given yourself that much needed break have been delayed or postponed. And so what I think a lot of this COVID has resulted for a lot of people in that overworking and powering through. And I have found, you know, since we talked last, I have gotten to a point where I had to sort of give in to the feelings of exhaustion and give in to what my body was telling me. And now for me, that doesn't translate into total rest because of my life circumstances, because there are things that I have to do, like make sure my daughter gets off to college. You know, there are things that I have to do, but anything that I didn't have to do. So my passion project, as much as I want to be, you know, I love to write, I love to create, I love to think about developing courses and coaching and how I'm going to grow my business. That's my brain loves to think in that way. And right now, I literally don't feel like I have the capacity. And so I noticed that I spent a little bit of time. I think I've actually been in that state for a little while, and I've forced it. And I've either forced it or I've spent a little bit of time beating myself up over what you were mentioning. Like, my gosh, I've just got to get motivated and I've got to get going. And now I've settled into this place that's not a very comfortable place for me, but it's a place where I realize that I'm tired, and my brain is not in a place where it's going to be able to magically create all this amazing content or have amazing things to say. It's just not. And that is a product of the state we've been in, to your point. That's a product of the state we've been functioning in for the last few months. And so I'm giving myself permission And what's challenging for me and what I think about every day right now is, I'm so used to sort of overperforming that my average performing is okay. Like it's okay, right? And I talk to employees about this all the time. I say, like, it's not realistic to think that you are going to be high in that state of high engagement 100% of the time. Like that means burnout. And yet it's really hard for me to take that advice myself.
Yeah, and I think that's such a great point. Like we are in a state where good is actually better than great because it is more sustainable. But I hear you on all of that. And, when we started this, I told you I'm on vacation, like thus I'm in a hoodie. But yet, I started vacation on Friday and I ended up working most of Friday as my first day of vacation. And my husband, bless his heart, is like, so how many days are you going to work before you feel like you really hit vacation? And like the weekend was kind of just downtime. And I did a few things, like each day I do a little bit less. And I actually gave myself 2 weeks through Labor Day because I realistically knew that the first week I wouldn't completely be able to let go. So I hope by next week that I truly get that rest too. But I'm feeling like, well, I don't have meetings, so now I can get caught up. And I sat down and I tried to write some things yesterday too. And I was like, I am not inspired to write at all. And so I went and I worked in the yard, and that was actually what I needed. I needed to just not have to think, get up out of my office that I've spent the last, however many months in, and give myself that break. But there was still in the back of my mind, like I have this big to-do list that I wrote first thing this morning before we hopped on this call. And I thought, no, like you should just put that away for a couple of weeks. But it's trying to give myself permission to do that too. And how can I coach and inspire other people? And I'm telling people, like, take a vacation, like you really need to take a vacation, but I'm not setting a good example myself. And it's kind of that moment of self-awareness. It's like, I talk to everybody about leading by example, yet I'm not doing it. Like people know I'm on vacation, I'm answering emails. I took some ad hoc calls yesterday. Like I have to actually draw the line on that too and say, I truly am taking vacation and that's what I expect you to do.
Yeah. And it's interesting because I think one of the only things, so I just did in fact take a couple of days off. I took a long weekend last weekend with my daughter, and I took Friday and Monday off. And, we went to California, and I brought my computer. I was intending to check in, get some work done. And if I wasn't getting my corporate work done, I was definitely intending on getting my, my passion work done. Right. And so I brought both computers. And so, I was really prepared to spend that time. And I thought, oh, well, I'll just have this quiet time now so I can empty out my inbox and I can do all these things. And on Friday, when we boarded the plane, there was a moment where I thought I should get my computer out and clean out my inbox on this flight. And then on the other hand, I have this book that is just a sort of frivolous, fun read that I'm always reading like self-development and something for my work. So I thought, or I could sit and just read this book and just stop. And so I chose to read the book. And what ended up happening is I thought about this a lot, and I had to sort of constantly check myself, but I never turned on my computers, either one of them. I didn't write a thing over those 4 days. I did not check email. And I had moments of feeling this kind of like low level anxiety about it, like I should. And then I had moments of that self-awareness that you're talking about where I thought, I can't, like I have to, I feel it in my body. I need to separate. I need to be present with my daughter, and be there for her. And so it was interesting because I sort of had to fight that feeling. And I came back to the office yesterday, and it was amazing. nothing terrible happened. Like everybody actually figured out how to go on without me answering all the emails or, orchestrating anything. The work got done. Anything that didn't was still here, is still here for me. And it's just interesting because I think sometimes, well, a lot of times we create our own anxiety. So I started really thinking about this yesterday because I started thinking about I've created a world where everyone is tugging at me. I've created that. Like it's not really anyone else's problem or fault that I'm in a state of overwhelm. There are definitely circumstances I can't control, but I can control, like I have set up my world in this way to be needed. And
Yeah.
I feel suddenly very accountable for that.
Well, and I certainly do that too. And it's one of the things that I've been thinking about because it is interesting when you step away and then everything functions
Uh-huh.
fine. But if you notice too, like when you started talking about it, you started doing the I should, like I should. So
Mhm.
it's this external pressure, and it's like, but why?
Mhm.
Uh, and thinking about just that, like a framework, and something that I'm constantly now asking myself is, will it matter next week? Will it matter a
Mhm.
year from now? And that time spent with your daughter on the plane, well, that will certainly matter a year from now. But whether you answered those emails or not, pretty insignificant. But we put all of this pressure on ourselves to show up in a certain way that is probably more for self than
Mhm.
for others,
Yeah.
which
Yeah.
is interesting because I like, I have all these friends that have corporate lives and also coach. And we all coach our clients not to do these things.
Mhm.
But most of us are all pretty guilty of it ourselves, of how do we create unrealistic expectations for
Mhm.
ourselves and not show the same kind of compassion um, to ourselves as we do to each other. Like it was really
Mhm.
easy for me to talk to you last week
Yeah.
or 2 weeks ago and say, well, we should probably just postpone some of these things. But I haven't given myself that same kind of care. And it doesn't sound like you have that internal struggle going on too. And it's just an interesting thing for us to all be aware of.
It is, and I think I have, like, sort of chuckled at myself thinking like, well, I'm just a coach who needs a coach, and don't all of us need a coach, right? Because you get in your own way and
Mhm.
um you sort of lose sight of things. And I think for me, creating this world where I'm needed and, I have urgency around most of the things that I'm doing. Um, it is this sort of, um, it's sneaky, right? Like you don't even realize, you think you're being helpful, you think you're being responsible. Like that's a big thing that comes up in my brain. Like
Yes.
I have this big role and I'm being responsible. I'm someone who does what I say I'm going to do. So if I'm committing to this, come hell or high water, I'm doing it and I'm willing to sacrifice myself. And it's interesting because hearing you say the coaches that we all sort of struggle with this. Um, Same. And the only coach that I've ever met that really has this nailed is a boundaries coach. And I'm in awe at her ability to set boundaries. And I want that, and I want my clients to do it. And I want the employees that I work with to do it. And you're right, that self compassion piece is, I think, the key to being able to do it. And so, not feeling, because when we're overworking or we're making everything urgent and we're responding, right away, texting, emailing, instant messaging, phone calls, and it's truly, if we're like in your terms, like if it's really on a lot of things that are pretty insignificant, we start to set up a world where where everything becomes urgent and we are needed for everything, right? And we're always available and there. And then, here we are. I think the COVID, in particular, has now people who operate in the way that we do in this way, which a lot of people do, I think now are in this state of exhaustion and going back and forth between being hard on yourself about it. Like, what's wrong with me? Why am I not motivated?
Mm.
Why can I not sit down and power through this task or whatever it is? Why is my house unorganized and I have all this time at home? All of these shoulds start to pile up. And if you're not careful, you end up really transmitting that into guilt and shame and carrying it around with you. And that is, something we would never do to a friend or a client.
Right.
Never. We would wholeheartedly want to help them release themselves from those feelings and unrealistic expectations and come into a state where they know that they are worthy and valued and enough, and whatever they're doing in this moment is worthy and valued and enough.
Yeah, that's such a beautiful statement, because you're spot on about the guilt and the shame and the worthy. And if we peel it back even one more layer, what is the message then that we are sending to all of the people that report to us?
Yes.
Uh, are we sending a message that we don't trust them, or that they aren't enough and that we have to step in? And taking those steps back and really not immediately responding. Like, people often sort these things out on their own, but have we been denying them the opportunity to do that with our care and responsiveness?
Mm-hmm. It's true. I actually have noticed, like, those days that I took off. I'm at a pretty small company, so um, I'm sort of, there's two of us on the people team in the HR department, and so that's not a lot. We're sort of like the buck stops here, and um, I have noticed that me just stepping back over those 2 days and not being urgent about responding to things that really don't necessarily need my response. It's interesting because I think it really empowered the other people on my team to step in and problem solve, be creative. A lot got done. And I thought, okay, this is better. Like, I don't actually want to be needed all the time. I actually have a lot of other things that I would like to be in a creative state or a strategic state to be able to think about and do to make a real difference. And so I think you're right. I think thinking about the example that we're setting for, people that report to us, for people who are watching us, even I think with platforms like you and I have, where we have corporate jobs and we also have people who, really value our coaching and insight on a personal level and a corporate level. I think we need to be an example, which is why I think it's good we're having this conversation, because I hope that we're just humanizing it, right? It's like,
Yes.
this is actually just like the human condition. We are coaches. We do have a lot of corporate experience. We also struggle, which I think is why we can show up and be authentic coaches, right? It's not where we don't have this like very prescriptive set of tools where it's like, well, if you just do this, like if you just make a list of everything that counts and get rid of everything that doesn't, your problems will be solved. It's like, no, it's actually deeper and more complex than that, and it's something that we struggle with, just being human beings.
Yes. And I do think, I find great value from our conversations,
Me too.
which is why I was like, let's record this.
Yeah.
I think other people might find value in it, but just um, the care and compassion and the thinking about all of these things, and the willingness, and you're always so open and willing to be vulnerable and to share what's happening in your life. I mean, I always come away from our conversations really energized, but they're really close to my heart because you get to see the real Sam, like, and that's really how you always show up. And, you know, on your radio show, people only got to see this really small piece, but right now being able to, you know, basically be a fly on the wall for one of our conversations to really see all of the things that we think about and how do we try to not only help others, but really help ourselves so that we can be better at helping others.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting because I don't think you can enter into this work like if you have a passion for, you know, development work, for coaching. You know, I think the best coaches that I know have also a passion for developing themselves, and so it is. You know, I used to think, am I like not content? Like, is that because I'm always sort of evolving and changing and trying new things? And does that mean that I'm like not content? And then I think now it's come full circle for me where I've realized that in order, you can't do this work authentically. You can't research compassion or, you know, research empathy and engagement and all of those topics and really care deeply about it and not change through that process and not evolve through that process. And so being able to accept that we have value to give because we care deeply about people and we care deeply about the work. And so we go deep into the research, right? But we also don't have all the answers. We're learning and evolving and changing too. And I think that that is where I feel comfortable being a people leader and also a coach by just actually saying, like, I don't have, you know, of course we all have ego, we do, right? Because we're human beings. But for me, I feel a deep sense of humility when I'm doing this work because with everything that I'm doing, I'm also asking myself, like, where I need to implement, where I need to change, where am I giving the advice and maybe not being as authentic as I want to be because I'm not taking the advice. You know, I had my husband at one point, maybe about a year ago, I can't remember what I was wrapped around the axle about, but something. And he looked at me and laughed and he said, "It sounds like maybe you need to listen to your own podcast." And I started laughing. I'm like, gosh, yeah, I know, right? Like, just, it's so hard to have all the answers and have it figured out, you know? And I think we dip into, you know, when we're stressed, when we're in fight or flight, we like sort of dip back in to maybe some of those things and behaviors that don't serve us. And then thankfully we're self-aware and we have each other to sort of be like, here, I'm going to extend a hand to you and I'm going to lift you out and remind you what you already know, you know, and that's what you did for me in our last conversation because you know, credited me for being very self-aware and vulnerable in that moment by saying I was tired. Yes, I did that. But also I was still there and I was prepared to power through. Like if you said to me, oh, if you listened and said, oh, I'm sorry you're tired, let's power through and build a course on compassionate leadership, I would have said yes in that moment. And so you listened and extended the hand to me when I really needed it. And I'm so grateful for that because I was in that moment, I was my own worst enemy.
And I'm trying not to just like openly laugh because our passion project is compassion.
Yeah.
But compassion is the action of lifting people out of that. And you know, talking about that difference between sympathy, empathy, and compassion. And that is part of everything that you just described. Like our whole, like we have to constantly evolve and we have to be learning. Because I don't think that we can pull people out of things if we haven't done the work ourselves.
Yeah.
I
I
have seen
totally
some
agree.
people talk about stuff, and they do have like, here is the framework, and I'll meet with you for 3 half-an-hour sessions and you'll be fixed. Well, first of all, I don't think any of us are broken.
Mhm.
I think that we need a helping hand from time to time. But how can I truly help if I don't truly understand? And how can I truly understand if I haven't done that work
Yeah.
myself?
Yeah, it's true, right? Because it's hard to have compassion when you don't have any sort of like empathy or understanding of what that person is experiencing. And so allowing, I think, the choice though to allow yourself to feel things is is I think a big key to it, right? Because this work, I mean, for me, it's total heart work. And I know for you too, it's total heart work. And there is a vulnerability that happens when you say, like, I want to understand this. Like, I want to understand compassion so that I can help others enter into compassion. And so I'm willing to sort of like go through the mud and open my heart, allow myself to feel everything in order to really figure out how to access compassion. And I think that choice to allow yourself to feel, I had a funny moment the other day with my daughter. She's going off to college. And so she's saying, in the process of saying goodbyes to people, which is always hard. She's had a lot of friends that have been leaving. So her best friend was getting ready to leave and she was already tearful. My daughter was tearful. And my husband and I are both, around her. And I hear my husband in the kitchen, say to her, he gives her the advice, well, Allie, like, just, this is a great time in your life. Like, just be strong. And she starts laughing because literally 2 minutes before that, I was hugging her and I said to her, just let yourself feel it all. And it's
Mhm.
so funny, right? Because there are these polarizing views. It's like, be strong, feel it all. And so I think for you and I, we're making the choice to show up and feel it all
Yes.
so that we can help other people access that authenticity and compassion and feelings. But it's a hard choice to make because it is easier, especially by the world standards, to be strong and not feel it.
Right. And by the world's standard to be strong in our world, that is actually the weakness.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's much easier to put the mask on and
Yeah.
to show up in an expected way than to actually tell people how important they are to you.
Yeah.
You give your power away. You
Yeah.
give your power away in an amazing way
Yeah.
because you get it back with love.
Yeah.
But that's frightening.
Yeah. It's so true. And
I
I
feel
think,
super emotional about like having that conversation.
yeah.
Just thinking about how your daughter had to have felt in that moment
Yeah.
too.
Yeah. And getting that advice, right? Just around, like, where do I land? Like, where will she
Mhm.
land in allowing
Right.
herself to feel, And I think it's even interesting from like a man woman perspective, right? Like, I look at my son who's a teenager and, the advice that he will get through his life will be strong, right?
Hmm.
Not feel it all. And my daughter will get more of the advice. She'll get both, but she'll get more of the advice that, it's okay to feel. It's sort of more acceptable to be emotional or whatever. And I think, one of the things that I'm excited to talk more about with you is this whole, we're both so passionate about compassion. And we've talked a lot about compassionate leadership. And I think that now with COVID, with the anti-racism work that is here, with all of these things, with the political landscape, just so with so many hardships befalling so many people, this sort of like communal suffering that's going on in different ways, leaders are going to have to be compassionate. And
Hmm.
so how can and that means they're going to have to take a pause and listen. They're going to have to voice how someone is important to them or acknowledge. And I think that's a place where you and I can make a real difference. But it's a requirement now. It's what we need.
So I'm thinking about that. I think that's true, but I don't think everyone will buy into it. And
No.
I think it's where we will see the real separation of companies with healthy progressive culture
Yeah.
and companies with stagnant cultures that become very toxic because people won't want to stay.
Mm-hmm.
But people, depending on how long things go on the way that they are, people will stay because they don't feel like they have choices. So then you have this workforce that feels undervalued, underappreciated, and is there in a little bit of a hostile way, but they know that they need a paycheck. And I think there's some interesting things already starting to happen in that space that could potentially keep us all really busy for a long time. And it's early in some of the studies, but there'll be some really, really fascinating things. But I wanted to actually go back to something that you said about your daughter.
Mm-hmm.
And I was thinking about the difference between the female and the male advice. And you said, you know, your daughter will get a lot more of the feel that and be compassionate advice. And I think that that's very true. And this is where then, when you get to the levels that you and I are, it becomes this inner conflict. Because how do you show up in these roles with this open heart and this compassion and still fit into, in some places, still fairly predominantly male roles? And you know, I find myself in those situations, and you know, like, there's no crying in business. Well, maybe there should be some days.
Right.
There's certainly days that I feel like everybody was just honest with their feelings. You'd actually get past the barrier and be able to move forward. But it's still something that we see in society, and we're going to continue to see until we get everybody, or as many people as possible, really being able to embrace that it's okay to feel.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think a big part of it is first that self-compassion piece of really embracing in a real authentic way that it's okay for you to be who you are, you know? And so showing up as your full self, I think, is a big key to that, right? And not making apologies for that, because it's interesting, right? Like, I'm sort of progressing through that work, moving through that work. You know, you and I were talking about how we don't coach on things we haven't fully processed, right? And so it's interesting because I'm at a stage in my career where I am in this executive role, and like, from the outside, people would look at my role and they go, oh my gosh, this is like the pinnacle of her career, right? Like, I'm like, I'm going to go out like this. This is like, you know, but what it also, the stage that I'm at also, I feel like I'm not apologizing anymore for who I am or my life circumstances. And so it's interesting because, you know, I'm confident enough to know that I do good work, to know that I was hired because I'm different than a lot of other HR leaders. And so I feel confident in that. And so it's interesting because Monday or Tuesday, I had a conversation with our CEO. And I said, you know, I've just got to be really honest with you. Here's what's happening. Here's what's happening with COVID, with my daughter leaving for school. My stress level is acutely high right now. I'm tired. And I do not think that I'm going to be really tracking and knocking it out of the park until after Labor Day. Like, I'm just going to be honest, because we're dropping her off. It's been a total whirlwind. I'm really stressed about it. And it's a huge life moment. Now, he is very compassionate and he has already sent 3 kids off. So he understands. So that worked in my favor. And in that moment, he just gave me total grace. He's like, you do great work. You've had a great year. I know you'll continue to do, everything. Let me know how I can help and try to enjoy the moment. And so here's where I still struggle. So I'm working through this standpoint of being like, I'm the only female on an all male executive team. And I finally am at the stage in my career where I am confident in my work and I believe I don't need to apologize for who I am and I can embrace wherever I'm at, right? Like if my life is really complicated in this moment or whatever. So that's good. That's progress. But where I still struggle are the internal feelings that I have about still not feeling 100% okay in that space, right? Like still not feeling like it's like completely authentic for me. I still have that anxiety inside. I have to perform, right? I'm willing to say it out loud. I'm willing to be vulnerable. I believe that I do good work, but I still have those feelings of guilt and shame that well up inside of me if I fall short in some way or don't get through, the emails. And so that is that's my work to do.
That's an interesting story. I'm wondering if after you finished the conversation with him, did you give yourself any space to like really check in to see how you felt in that moment after having that conversation?
I did. And it was interesting because I felt relieved, almost like I had outed myself, like it was like, okay, I feel like a mess right now and I've said it out loud. And so I felt sort of freedom in that. And then, he was so compassionate towards me that I felt relieved. And I also feel like it did give me permission to focus on, my daughter and where I'm at right now. So that was good. But like I said, I still have that. I'm still fighting that feeling of internal angst.
Yeah, I'm glad that you did that. I was wondering if somewhere in the back of your mind you had that feeling of, he gave me an out and now I'm going to perform because of that whole
Mhm.
almost reciprocity. Like you gave me an out, but now I'm
Right.
going to like thank you for it by like
Right.
going and digging in, because I think that's also a natural response that can
Yeah.
happen in those moments. You make yourself vulnerable, you ask for space, somebody grants you the space, and then you unwind it because of the guilt and shame and the anxiety to be a top performer.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think I also think that I've made progress there. Now, I will say, I think that with COVID, I just have nothing left to give. So it's like, am I really being authentic or am I literally in a state of exhaustion where it's like, well, you've pushed yourself to the point, there's so much truly going on that I just have to yield to it. I don't know which. I guess I'll find out as I go along, and process through it.
I think if you could still power through it if you truly felt like
Yeah.
you had to. I think it's
Yeah.
probably that internal friction of trying to rationalize it. Like, well, I can't do it, so it's okay. Like, because I do that too, but I know that there have been moments where I have been emotionally exhausted, physically ill, and still done like crazy things to get through work. So
Yeah.
there's moments where I think, oh, I just can't do it. And it's like, I'm actually making a choice, but I'm trying to make an excuse to make myself feel better.
Yeah.
Just recognize that I don't need to do it. And I see those traits in you. I'm sure you've done plenty of insane things
Yeah.
yourself. And I was in the hospital
That's
with
the
pneumonia
key.
once, and the nurse took the phone away from me because I was doing conference calls from the hospital bed with an IV and oxygen. And looking back on it, it's like that really didn't matter at that moment in time.
Mhm.
But it sure felt like it did. And at least I can tell you that that was 15 years ago. So
Yeah.
hopefully I've recovered.
You've evolved. Yeah. But I think you just said it, right? It's crazy. You said, I'm sure you've done some crazy things to yourself, right? And that is the key. It works for everyone else. You do it to yourself. And why, I mean, you and I could talk about this forever, and I know we're out of time, but why are we okay with damaging ourselves? Like, why is it okay for us to do those crazy things, or put our self-care on the bottom of the list?
Because we are still dealing with, am I enough?
Yes. And that's it, right? So how do we get to the point where there is nothing more important than what our heart says is important, right? Our self-care, our family, whatever those priorities are, and how can we get our actions in alignment with that? And that is a question and something I've been working on for years. And I haven't figured out the answer yet, but I think you and I can.
I think we can find the answer together.
Yeah, I think we should.
This is